We live in an age of political polarization and preference bubbles, of economic change, rising threats, and a rapidly changing world. Canada needs to stay relevant. We need more smart conversations. We need to dive into critical issues and big ideas with passion and unrestrained optimism. I'm Erin O'Toole. Welcome to the Blue Skies Podcast.
Welcome to Blue Skies. We are living in an age of incredible disruption, deglobalization, great power rivalry, and elections in the era of Donald Trump 2.0. We saw an election in Canada that had a surprise win in many ways for the Liberal Party, with Prime Minister Mark Carney winning almost a majority, a strong minority, despite the fact in my old party, the Conservative Party, had a lead for a year and a half, 2 years, looking like they were going to win with a certainty. Australia similarly wrapped up an election just last week. We'll be able to talk about this. And what does a southern polar nation, or a nation with interest in the southern pole, Antarctica, have to do with Canada and our interests in the Arctic? Can we bridge south and north to have partnerships? What type of submarine should Canada buy? What type of submarine will Australia sail in the age of AUKUS? Today, we're going to explore all of these questions with one of the leading thinkers globally, down under. Dr. Elizabeth Buchanan holds a PhD in Russian strategy and completed postdoc studies at the NATO Defence College in Rome. She served previously as head of research for the Royal Australian Navy's Sea Power Centre and is now a senior fellow at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and co-director and co-founder of the Polar Warfare Studies program at the Modern War Institute of West Point Military Academy, our rival hockey school when I was at the Royal Military College of Canada. Elizabeth is author of several books on polar issues, including several upcoming books, How to Lose a Continent and Competitive Cooperation at the Ends of the Earth. Well, she's coming to us today from the other end of the earth. Welcome to Blue Skies, Dr. Elizabeth Buchanan, or I'll call you Liz. Welcome.
Thank you, Erin. I'm really excited for this conversation.
As am I. Now, before we get into some of the politics and geopolitics and defense and strategic studies, what drew you in terms of your academic pursuit of polar studies, the Arctic and Antarctic, and the role of the Arctic in geopolitics?
This is my favorite question to answer because I think my answer is generally surprising for most people. So I actually began university as a medicine surgery candidate. And I completed, a semester or so, found out I had a horrific fear of blood. So that kind of nixed my plans to be a top Australian surgeon, right? So as anyone does, before going home to tell my dear parents that the university dream had taken a bit of a segue, I enrolled in a liberal arts degree. I finished that degree and then I actually went to Royal Dutch Shell, which had a downstream footprint here in Australia. And it was really by accident that the polar stuff came on my radar, which, a happy accident, as most things in life are. We were in the office discussing there was a sort of new pivot to deal with the offshore Alaska resources at the time for Shell. And I was involved in some early governance discussions there because of my undergraduate background in Russian politics. As you'd understand, that was a key factor in all international oil firms trying to engage with the Russian Arctic at the time. And it was just crazy to me that there was no substantial studies done that looked at why Russia was needing to or looking to cooperate with Western firms and Western partners in the Arctic. And yet at the time, it had this sort of foreign policy that was increasingly assertive, aggressive. We had Crimea, we've had, list any Eastern Europe country getting scared from what Russia was interested in doing. And so I set about originally to write just a research paper for my boss, looking at options to work with Russia to unlock the Arctic for commercial gain. And that kind of fell into a broader project that then became a PhD project. And I essentially looked at the ways in which the Arctic was very much a special case, a siloed case for Russian foreign policy, and made a few calls about how cooperation would be a basis for engagement there for Russia. Like to say I was correct, although instead of being Western firms, it's now become the Indian and the Asian firms because of our own decisions we've made in the West here. Yeah, and then I guess being in Australia, it was fascinating to have a look at the kind of forces that are at play in the Arctic situation. So I usually talk about it as a trinity. So you've got resource insecurity, and that's everything from fisheries, fresh water, to critical minerals, oil, gas, hydrocarbons. Interacting with just basic Great Power 101, strategic competition. And then on the third sort of bucket of issues is climate change. And wherever you fall on the climate change question, I think it's undeniable that there are changes underway in the physical environment in the Arctic. So when those three could sort of engage, the synergy there was fascinating to me because it throws off results that I think are pertinent to other parts of the world that could be deemed global commons. So whether we're talking about outer space, high seas elsewhere, obviously the Arctic's not a global common, but the high seas section of the Arctic Ocean are, and obviously Antarctica. And to be a nation, to be a national of a country that claims, 42% of a continent. We have postage stamps, we have, teaching in our history, in our administration and governance. We talk about the Australian Antarctic Territory, not just a flag in the ground. It's something that's very, very important to our country. And yet we have no capability focus there for the Antarctic. Our defence partnerships refuse to talk about it. We don't think about it. And the big one is our major alliance with the US has not had one OSMIN, which is our annual defense meeting between Washington and Canberra. We have never talked about Antarctica. We obviously have different positions there on sovereignty. But it's a big oversight. And that's why, I'm really keen to have this discussion with you because I've been increasingly looking at the Canadian-Australian relationship. We have so many overlapping interests in the polar regions, whether it's Canada trying to get into Antarctica, but it's also Australia trying to understand what's coming down the line for the Antarctic region, rather. What are you dealing with in the Arctic?
Yeah.
How are you dealing with Chinese presence in your own national industries in the Arctic?
Before we get into that, why don't we, because that's an incredible journey from working for Shell and getting asked to prepare a research note and turning that into a PhD and a lifelong pursuit of study, helping co-found the polar warfare studies at West Point. So that little research note turned into your focus. But before we talk about the great paper, the defense publication, you had a paper on Australian-Canadian partnership. Why don't you give us, for the Canadian listeners of Blue Skies, a bit of an update on your election, because some of the international coverage of it used the re-election of Anthony Albanese as sort of the companion victory to Mark Carney, that both elections had concerns with voters about the situation in the United States, and that it helped sort of the progressive party in the left or the center left win despite some challenges they were facing. You were telling me as we started that that's not the whole picture. There was a bit of a political realignment in the election in Australia at the individual voter level. Why don't you give us your take? Because our coverage certainly focused on Peter Dutton and the Liberal leaders' challenges escaping the sort of the Trump phenomenon. But you're saying more happened. Give us a synopsis.
Yeah, and I think this is the issue with, our globalized media landscape. We get the stories that resonate and that are easier to digest. But for the Australian uh, federal election we had, a week or so ago, it was very much framed internationally. And I guess some parts of our domestic discourse as well framed it as a blanket rejection of Trump, and it was very much tagged on the heels of the Canadian election, which was, Canada has also rejected the Trump platform and the Trump mandate in their own political system. And so I guess, that became the byline for us for the Australian election as well, which was, liberal West countries and democracies throughout the world are saying they don't want to go the same way as the US in terms of the Trump platform. And I can understand that to a point, but what happened in Australia is the implications are so severe. We've had a complete realignment of our political environment. So we are no longer really just the two-party system. We had as we call them, independents. I don't know if you're familiar with the term, but we also call them teals, which is essentially they are, either ex-members of our Liberal coalition, which is our Liberal Party, and our
Yeah, mixed
Nationals.
color, the teal color.
The
Yeah.
teal. So very much still in the conservative agenda in most places, but running on their own. That section of candidates saw a huge surge. So as much as, yes, we've got Albanese back in the White House. There's a Freudian slip if there ever was one. We've very much got Albanese back at the Lodge, we call it, the Lodge, very Australian, the Lodge. For and the Lodge, we've got him back in. Whether or not he serves a full term, I don't know. I think we'll have a dissolution of parliament because I simply don't know how we get all of these independent seats to work with the government, to pass anything, to move anything. But then that points to another kind of outcome of our election, which was sadly, and I've been writing a bit on this, the Australian people didn't seem to want to make a hard choice. So it was easier to put in a continued trust, or I guess, not wanting to have to make hard decisions in allowing a government to just continue to plod along and kick the can down the road. So we will print money, defense funding will fall, which is, I hope we talk about that in terms of our naval and our force structure. But then at the same time, it was not fair to say it was a rejection of the coalition at this election, because we had this party, and, it was quite concerning, turn up to the election and during the campaign, drop a defense strategy or a defense policy to take to the election the week of going to the polls. So this was no real run up. No, it didn't seem to have a plan. I guess we can lay blame at the party itself, but I think it's more a case of the Australian voters just feeling desensitized with the international environment. There's a loss of, I guess, faith in our country to innovate, to have to stand up and, take on our fair share in the region.
So a bit of a realignment, given that people were choosing a bit of a new path with the teals. As certainly the Canada-US relationship is much more profound and existential for our economy. So I do think it was a heavy aspect of deciding for a lot of swing voters in Canada. But one thing I wanted to get to, now that our listeners know a little bit more, in fact, that the election result in Australia was not really just the same sort of a progressive left winning. There was much more of a shakeup on the ground. But what's interesting, Mark Carney was really only prime minister for about 10 days. Never stepped foot in the House of Commons, but he traveled to Paris, he traveled to London, and his most significant announcement on a defense and a security basis was announcing the Jindali Operational Radar Network, the Born Over the Horizon radar system, a purchase from Australia of over the horizon capability that was built also by the Albanese run up to the election as Australia's largest defense export ever. And that led you to write a really interesting piece saying Australia, Canada should build out polar partnership. So first, talk for a moment about what the JORN system is, what purpose it serves in terms of Arctic security, and then talk a bit about the premise of Australia, an Antarctic nation, working in partnership on a polar basis with Canada, an Arctic nation.
Let's start with JORN, first of all. So this is essentially a trusted, a well-used and rolled out Australian air and sea radar. I'm speaking on my own personal views here and not that of the Australian government, but it is believed to have a operational reach of about 4,000 kilometres. It could be more, unofficially. But essentially it is a radar for Australia that we have deployed throughout our northern approaches. So another commonality with Canada, obviously, and Australia is huge open sea approaches that are difficult to, number one, defend in a way that's economical, in an enduring manner, and also Australia is limited when it comes to its defence posture in terms of personnel. So we have such a huge area to keep eyes on, and we have limited people to do so. So this is obviously the answer. So it is able to pick up any sort of air and sea approaches, up to 4,000 officially kilometres away. It was billed as, it obviously has applications in your Arctic approaches as well. It is so precise, the technology, that it would see a Cessna plane take off in East Timor for Australia, and for Canada, you'd be looking at, geese. I'm sure there's some kind of Canadian geese in the Arctic that would set off that. So you can watch your migration patterns. You can also look at what Chinese fishing vessels are doing off the coast, which I expect to see a lot more of in the region in the coming decade. So it was billed, yes, as the largest Australian defence export in terms of fiscal value in history. And my piece was trying to tease out, number one, why the question of, okay, well, why haven't we done this before? And why aren't we doing more if we've got all these commonalities with Canada to the point where they want our technology or they want our solutions? Because we aren't even talking about the polar regions. Like that wasn't a point of discussion. It was just a defense technological transfer, number one. And I had issue with that because it was much more than that. It is the beginning of a partnership I'm hoping that we can really unlock and build upon. And we'll talk about that later, hopefully. But number two, there was a lot of kind of misinformation about the transfer. Primarily, it was an interesting time for the government to announce it. So it was done in Australia in such a kind of careful manner. And so there was just a very quiet press statement by the defence and the defence industry ministers, which was, had a meeting, agreed to sell JORN, job well done, everyone. But then one or two media outlets picked up that we had originally promised to sell this technology to the US. And at the time, they were going to be the first person in line, the first customer in line. And it seemed that the Canadians had jumped ahead. Now, this also occurred in a domestic climate in Australia, which was coming to terms with the second Trump administration. So I'm not sure what the discourse was like in Canada, but unfortunately, the Australian media landscape was just so off the pulse in terms of what was going on in the US that the idea of a Trump administration returning was, not going to happen. We were going to be dealing with a Kamala Harris administration. Like that was the framing. So there was a lot of kind of whiplash that was going on. And so some pundits, I guess, were framing it as this is a signal that the Australian government is not going to be prioritizing the US under Trump. We're looking for other partners. And for me, I was like, well, this is interesting because I think what the US is doing with its realignment in its national interest and how it's going about securing those, absolutely, their prerogative. Any state should do so, and we should expect them to do so. But that wasn't the case for the Australian decision to sell to Canada first. And I guess I really wanted to fix that piece of misinformation because it was upsetting me. I mean, Lockheed Martin was one of the key stakeholders in delivering one of the recent phase updates in John. So we can't be so naive to think that the US don't already have a handle on what John is or have it integrated somewhere, right? So my other interest in the John sale between Australia and Canada was simply that it was kind of a flash in the pan and nothing happened from that. And so I just thought there has to be some momentum. I'm no longer in government, in defence anymore. So I guess the seams of it in the social space, I really wanted to get people thinking and push towards the foundation of a more meaningful bilateral relationship between Canada and Australia. On the polar point, yes, John will arguably be utilised in the Canadian Arctic or as part of your NORAD system, a component of. We bilaterally, Australia and Canada, do not do near enough when it comes to the polar regions. So if we go down to a scientific or a research or a university level, there are a number of Canadian scientists and Australian scientists that work together on various projects. That exists. There's an ecosystem there of partnership, but one up into the kind of formal government or department level engagement, it just stops. So there is a few Canadian initiatives in the defence space to do with the polar regions, although more so the Arctic, right? Which would make sense geographically. But it's a research network that has New Zealand defence researchers in it. So no Australians though. So it feels very, haphazard. And after having the honour of working in an Australian government department in defence, I can understand that it's probably not done in a purposeful manner to keep the Australians out. I think it's just a case of we're not connecting like-minded people in an enduring way. It's kind of haphazard, right? So I really wanted to see, I do want to see more of a Canadian-Australian polar partnership here. So if we just unpack a few similarities in terms of both of our nations in both of the regions, I think it might be useful for your listeners because I know, having done quite a few fieldwork trips, the first 15 minutes of a discussion that I have with anyone is trying to realign people to the fact that I'm not there to talk about the Antarctic. I'm there to talk about the Arctic. So what would an Australian be interested in when it comes to the Arctic? Kind of far away, although the same can be said for the Canadian interest in the Antarctic, quite far away. So for the Australians in the Arctic, I think our principal focus is a missed and a kind of a lost historical lesson. So we had Sir Hubert, right? Who his ashes were actually scattered by US submarine Skate, right, in the 60s. He was, one of the, I think now officially in the record, he was the first human to fly over the North Pole. He was an Australian. So we've got a historical link there. The more recent one, obviously, is the Svalbard Treaty. So Australia, or Spitsbergen Treaty, is signatory to that. So my children have economical rights to go to Svalbard and mind their heart's content. We don't think about that. And then the third kind of bucket of issue is the Australian security or national security interest is at stake to a degree when it comes to the Arctic. So as you've got new Arctic trade routes opening, we have a potential reorientation of global transportation networks. So if we're thinking of Europe to Asia, we're no longer worried about the Malacca Strait, South China Sea. We've got the potential for Asia to Europe to be linked via the Northern Sea route. Not so much the Northwest Passage, just viability, but the Northern Sea route, Northeast Passage. So what that means is if that kind of global artillery for transportation comes online, you then have entire countries in Southeast Asia who are plunged into, economic peril. Singapore, right? 90% of the economy is reliant on shipping, on transportation, being a transshipment hub for the region. So if we are no longer needing much of Southeast Asia to be significant points within the global supply chains, countries very much like Australia become expensive markets to service. Simply get down to Australia. So our cost of goods, because 99% of everything is shipped in for Australia, including 95% of all our fuel, So there's a dire security interest there in terms of just the cost to get things to Australia if we have a reorientation north of global transportation for goods and services. The other, I guess, in that third bucket of geostrategic changes underway in the Arctic that implicate Australia are understanding how China has inserted itself into the Arctic. So it's very much internationalized this area. People point to the Arctic policy that it tabled. Yes, that is a point of interest. What we don't talk about enough is that China has a very legitimate Antarctic position in the treaty system. 5, almost 6 stations, outfunds anyone in the Antarctic just in terms of polar capabilities and research. And they are yet to publish. I've obviously shared components of a more working paper level Antarctic policy they have, but they have yet to table a formal strategy for the Antarctic. So for me, I go, well, if you're more of an illegitimate player in the Arctic, why do you have a formal policy that you share with the world? And yet, if you are a legitimate actor in another part, in another pole, where is your formal strategy? So it shows you a bit about prioritization. But anyway, the Australian interest would be China's weaponization to a degree of international norms and laws. The Central Arctic fisheries ban is one to watch extremely closely for the Australian Southern Ocean EEZ and resource interests there. When it comes to the Canadian interest in the Arctic, I mean, basic geography, that's part of your back doorstep. There is obvious Canadian interest in the Antarctic. I know over the last 2 years, there's been a real push to really unlock that identity. You've had your first naval mission in recent months down to Antarctica.
Yeah.
For 2 years now, I think, the Canadians have been trying to become consultative parties, which means essentially they're allowed to vote in the Antarctic Treaty System. That's a pipe dream. I know that there is plenty of Canadian focus on upping their research portfolio in Antarctic matters, which you need to prove to say that you deserve consultative party voting rights. Primary authors funding in Antarctic studies have, really accelerated. You've got the ice breaking capability, ice hardened vessel capability, although there needs to be work there, although there's an opportunity for Australia. But you're dealing with a consensus organization in the Antarctic. So until China and Russia feel that states like Belarus can be given consultative party status, and you need everyone to agree. You're not going to have Canada get the red carpet rolled out and welcomed into that forum.
No, let's cut it there, because I think that's a great spot to leave. When I was in the Harper government and we invested in what was called CHARS, the Canadian High Arctic Research Station, that we allow other countries from around the world to use for Arctic research. There was always an understanding that world-class center would springboard to us doing more research and connecting in with the Antarctic Research Network, because to be a real polar player, we had to have a presence in the Antarctic discussions about polar issues, Arctic, subarctic issues, and really all these discussions about changing sea lanes, sea routes, these sorts of things, which you highlighted well. Singapore's role as a hub. 70% of the world's trade right now goes through the South China Sea, and China's control of it, or attempts to control of it, shows just how important all of these routes are. And then, of course, you talked about the polar route and the Northeast Passage, which China and even India are going to partner on this polar Silk Road, as some have called it. China describes itself as a near Arctic state. So for Canada to be part of all of these conversations from a Western democratic standpoint, I've been arguing that we have to not just invest more in our Arctic, but participate in the dialogue related to the Antarctic region. And that's where you're saying Jorn could be the first of many steps in a partnership between Canada and Australia.
Absolutely. And it's about finding, I guess, for now, until we can get a swell of interest, it's about finding those low-hanging fruit, right? The problem, I think, and I think this is shared by most of the liberal democratic countries, is that a sense of urgency and foresight when it comes to defense issues doesn't seem to kind of materialize until the threat's knocking on your door or it's arrived. So I don't know if the way that our democratic countries are geared when it comes to political issues that are down the line, that are beyond the 3-year political bandwidth, how we deal with the fact that our national interests are under threat when it comes to the Antarctic. Both of them. I mean, this is, for the Canadian point of view, it is very much considered a global commons, right? The Australians might disagree, but we've got a claim there. Would Canadian focus on the Antarctic be strengthened in terms of how it can get a footprint in the Antarctic if it worked with Australia more? Yes, absolutely. Your CHARS Centre, it just breaks my mind that you've had these ideas and these mechanisms on the table, and they've not been fostered, and they've been lost because we've lost time. Our countries have lost time, and time is power. And, we've lost the ability to conjure a presence in these polar regions. But you see that Russia and China have set aside their, century-long issues that will continue to endure, right? They're very much not on the same page when it comes to their own shared border, right, in Eurasia. And to watch the Middle East and Eurasia kick off, it will be what Africa has become, which is this real kind of point of tension between these two powers that we don't talk about. But they set it aside, right? Because there's plenty of gains to make now while the West is so divided and kind of chasing our tails. But they've got Yellow River Station, Chinese research station on Svalbard, and Russia is working to welcome any of the BRICS countries to come and establish research programs. So what is stopping, the Canadians and the Australians from saying, we're going to put together I guess we could do a Commonwealth Light polar program where we spend, 6 months of the year at either pole. These are the agendas. And, I know that from the Australian point of view, the fear is we can't militarize the polar regions. And the idea, I think, is we've got no confidence in ourselves to be able to toe that grey line and say, well, this is a research endeavour for the great of humanity. This is about showing, our ability to explore and to innovate as a humanity in these regions and to push the boundary, right, of human endeavour. It's about having presence, and presence is power in these regions. And until we normalize having an Australian contingent in the Arctic or a Canadian contingent in the Antarctic, it's going to be seen as encroachment at some point. And it never had to be seen as encroachment, is my point. So it's the long-term thinking of these issues as well.
I was one of the early voices in favor of a movement called CANZUK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK, and I often used an example of partnership on defense procurement, where smaller countries within the Five Eyes could do more together on a defense sustainability capability standpoint, because we were often dependent on the United States or the UK. And CANZUK gained steam for two reasons: Brexit discussions and what was the UK going to do post-Brexit, a revitalized Commonwealth, but also because of the isolation streak of the first Trump presidency. That's really when the Four Eyes, or Three Eyes in terms of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, should have started becoming more self-reliant, more work together at that time, because there's only more isolation now with the Trump administration. And that leads me to the final section I want to talk about, spend a little bit of time on this with you, Liz, is you're good for some of the best provocative headlines I've ever seen in articles. And you wrote one last year entitled, "AUKUS is unhinged from reality. Australia will only ever be a pit stop for nuclear submarines." AUKUS debate and alliance with a great interest, because I've been an advocate for submarines for Canada for many, many years. And to educate the listeners a little bit, Malcolm Turner, when he was Prime Minister, had an agreement to buy French submarines, a standard diesel conventional submarine. And Scott Morrison upended that plan, canceled the order with France to go in the AUKUS, the Australian UK-US deal, to buy American nuclear submarines. Turnbull, in retirement, has criticized Morrison for that decision and for the cost. I've said to people here, having been a submarine hunter in the Air Force here myself, that I said I would buy anyone dinner the day Australia sails its own nuclear submarine. That's why I liked your headline. It completely supported my argument. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts on AUKUS. Obviously, the security partnership with the US is key. Australia has been engaged in every armed conflict the United States has been in, even when Canada hasn't participated, like in Vietnam or Iraq. So that security relationship is critical. But is AUKUS realistic when it comes to submarines? And I want you to go full tilt on this one.
Erin, this is catnip for me. So obviously what follows are views of myself, of my own, and don't reflect the official Australian government line. And I say official government line because I strongly believe there are very few officials in Australia, in the submarine, in the nuclear, in the defence sector, who actually believe we will have an SSN capability. Now, this matters because if you don't, in the public services, it's a fickle thing, but if you don't believe in the end goal, if you don't believe in what you're working towards, you get an entire workforce of yes men, paper pushers, and busy work. And with liberal democracies, we're famous for this. You know, it's a 9 to 5 check-in. It's a public service. You get your superannuation, you get your leave, you're paying your mortgage, your kids are growing. You know, you'll take a cruise when you're 60 and you retire. And I think we're at the point now where our generation, millennial, I'll put my hand up for that one, are now in positions of middle management to senior management in these ecosystems. And I am disheartened that we have not taken risks and we have not wanted to, excuse the pun, shake the boat. And really try and come up with a solution to this an existential defense issue for an island nation, to defend ourselves, for our children and their children's future. AUKUS comes along. The best way I think I can frame AUKUS, truly, is that it is hocus pocus. So it is a, I don't want to say smoke show because there's enough of handshaking occurring and small kind of piecemeal agreements. Progressive ITAR wins for Australia. That we are to get nuclear-powered submarines. First of all, we will buy 3 to 5 from the US off the Virginia block. And then we will be in a position to be building with the UK their future submarine, SSN AUKUS. Now, it sounds great, but in reality, we are putting a down payment on something. We're throwing money at something, Australia, for something we might get. And for me, it's just not logical. Number one, to not have a plan B behind the scenes. So I fully agree that we need a submarine capability. But I don't think, and I like nuclear-powered submarines actually, but I don't think we need to own nuclear-powered submarines. I don't see the need for that. I think that Australia should unlock a little bit of strategic free riding in the nuclear debate for submarines. So if we work with what we have, and go from there. We are a huge island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. So 2 key strategic theatres. So why don't we, and this is my pit stop argument, why don't we weaponize in many ways our strategic geography? We've done it before, World War II in the Pacific. So our allies, our partners, should they need a pit stop, right? Like any racetrack. So we should be working towards sustaining and maintaining SSN capabilities of our partners, and then free ride off the strategic and the security uplift that provides Australia. The idea that Australia needs to operate its own nuclear-powered submarines is wildly, beyond the strategic remit for Australia, even in 3 decades' time. What is the utility of a SSN? So, right, we're talking here about the stealthiness, we're talking about the distance it can go. So we're about shaping and deterring, right? But in all of the political discourse and in selling the SSN solution for Australia, it is to deter China. We've been very open about that. But the timeline then doesn't make sense. So we're looking at, 3 decades minimum. Do we expect a competitor just to kind of cool their heels for 3 decades and say, we'll wait till you're ready? It just doesn't make sense. Whereas right now, and this is part of what we call Pillar 1, which is the nuclear powered submarine capability for Australia, I'm saying don't nix AUKUS, don't nix Pillar 1, work towards having that capability, but I just don't think it's a capability that we should own and operate. It's one that we should support and sustain and maintain. So we need to grow quite a few of our ports and our hosting capabilities to look after crews. and then we can strategic free ride off the shaping and the deterring that the US and
Yeah.
the UK bring on the French nuclear
Yeah.
powered submarines that they can do in the region.
Talk for a moment about the cost of them as well, Liz. Just their gargantuan cost would squeeze out all other aspects of Australia. And did it come up in the election at all? Since did AUKUS come up in the recent election?
Yeah, it hasn't so much as it hasn't come up to the point of we need to throw it out the window. Yes, there's been a kind of small discussion about we maybe need to talk about alternatives, so plan Bs or Cs, but it's not about getting rid of the AUKUS agreement. Frankly, I don't think many people understand what it is, and as I say, it's just a hocus pocus kind of, we'll agree to do this. The issue I think that former Prime Minister Turnbull really rightly points out is that lawfare, or not so much lawfare, but the legal intricacies of this agreement matter. So Congress cannot release for sale, even if we're paid for them, Virginia's, if it believes that its own submarine footprint will be detrimentally affected. So if we know coming down the line they are not producing as many as they need, why on earth do we think that they're going to say, oh, Australia, here's the ones that we promised you could have? Like, that's no national strategic interest. No country would do that. It's dumbfoundingly stupid. But also, you talk about, I guess, the cannibalization of the rest of our defense force. And yeah, that matters because, as I said when we first started speaking in this session, we are a massive continent, but we are a small population. And I deeply, respect the work of our ADF, our defense force. My husband served in the army for 2 decades. But we need to be smarter about how we utilize our personnel. We can't be everywhere, but at the same time, submarines cannot be the single solution. We need long range strike. So the idea that AUKUS and the submarines are sold as a solution to our defense concerns, for me, is letting the government and our leaders, our elected officials, off easy because we're not asking them the hard questions. It was interesting when AUKUS was announced, and then we had the current government come into power the last election. Sorry, 2 elections ago. We all in the community, in the strategic affairs community, expected there to be some kind of review into AUKUS. And there was nothing. And I do wonder just how perplexing it might have been for the former government that signed this agreement, because I do think it was a case of huge announceable, sounds good in theory, should work. Surely the next government, should they come into power, look under the hood and go, oh, that's a bunch of promises. But they didn't. The government didn't. And I have it on good authority that the former government was quite shocked that this didn't happen, because it was almost a get out of jail free card, right? The former government has inked this deal. It works in places. Let's, put pillar 2, which is advanced technologies. Let's get that on fire. Let's put a fire under that and get that cooking. That works for everyone. We can deliver it. We can set up a sovereign industry base for a lot of this, for a lot of these deliverables. But, that is just bobbing along and you haven't really heard a peep out of it. But it didn't happen. So the only, I guess, answer to that is it works for the government of the day in Australia to be able to point to this big flashy acronym and say, well, it's a very complicated piece of kit that we're getting. And we know it's complicated because it simply costs hundreds of billions of dollars. So it must be complicated. And, the basic questions of, okay, but what we want the capability for is an issue arguably right now and not in 3 decades. So my point about the pit stop power was just there is a smarter way to efficiently get the strategic gain that we want out of an SSN footprint in the region. Keep the threat at bay from Australian shores. We're doing our bit for the alliance and our partners. But we're also then diversifying our defence bucket. But I would ask you, Erin, that I've never asked somebody in, government of the day right now or in public service and defence, and you ask them at work if we're going to see an AUKUS submarine, and it's all the way absolutely we're working, and then down at the pub at 5:30, we won't see them. And for someone like me, like I worry about that, this is my kid's future. And the idea that my son will be of age when we potentially get the first secondhand Virginia. His children are meant to be coming of age when we start, cutting steel for an SSN AUKUS. But we don't have the people to crew them. So when it comes to the nuclear submarine question for Australia, I think we will continue to equip and train our young submariners to be embedded in UK and US submarine crews, pick up some really awesome experience. I think we might have mixed crews at some point for the Virginias. I do not see us building a nuclear-powered submarine in Australia ever. And if we are so set on the SSN for Australia idea, I would strongly urge government to focus on partnering on the SSNX with the US and not what the UK is trying to do.
Thank you for that. It's a bit of the hocus pocus, and the politicians are like the Wizard of Oz. Don't pay no attention of the man behind the curtain putting all this. What's interesting, and I've said to a few people, this is a bit of a modern version of the Dreadnought program, where the British Empire wanted all the colonies to pay for warships. This is what the U.S. is really doing. They want to spread out the cost of some of their new building of the arsenal of democracy, and under the guise of Australians will cut steel and man them. The Canadian experience, and here's where our partnership could help. We had a white paper in 1987 that proposed nuclear submarines for our Arctic. It was eventually canceled by the same government that said it was going to do it, the Mulroney government. And I spoke to him and other people about it. The real issue is it is a submarine capability for 5 times the cost. You need new infrastructure, so our existing ports would not have been sufficient for an SSN. The crew capability is enormous, and right now our Navy is short 30% of operational personnel, and then the engineering capability. Canada is one of the best countries in the world in terms of nuclear engineering. We were the 3rd country to have controlled nuclear fission, but we don't have the capability. In fact, the U.S. Navy is short nuclear engineers and are having a hard time kitting up what they have right now. So this is one big farce, really, as you said, hocus pocus. And I've said to people here in Canada, let's go into pillar 2 of AUKUS if that technology thing really happens. But for our Arctic, we need a submarine in the water in the early 2030s. It can be conventional with range, with air-independent propulsion. There's a lot of modern tools that would allow us to basically park in the sea lanes. We don't need to go for 3 weeks under the ice. We need to monitor the sea lanes. And a conventional sub, along with subsea cables and sensor monitoring of all the pinch points, I think would be sufficient. So I'm waiting for one day the whole AUKUS hocus pocus to come down to earth and us really talk serious turkey about what we need in the short term for our countries.
So, and then there's 2 elements to this hocus pocus discussion. I feel like you might need to trademark it and get it on t-shirts, of which I will invest in. But it is, we all agree in the Australian political spectrum, whether you are gung-ho for submarines or nuclear-powered submarines and AUKUS, or you're not. But we pay now and we might get later. Like, this doesn't make sense. But it also is perplexing that we've seen such a huge domestic, in the election results, rejection of the US. And yet, in our procurement and our decision making around future planning, it is unbelievably reliant and tied to the US. So there's some hard truths here about just like basic logic. But I think generally for Canada and Australia, we need to, I guess, make the idea of working smarter, not working harder, great again. I don't think it's such a hard sell for the general public, let alone academics and commentators and experts alike, that an SSN is a fantastic piece of kit and we need it, but we don't need to own it. There has to be other ways to get this in our defence toolkits for Canada and for Australia. Look to the French. The French and the Brits, this Global Britain project is dying a slow death. But for the Canadians to say, hey, how about you park something in the Canadian Arctic? We'll share the load with crewing. You teach us. Like, there's so many smarter ways to do this. And it dumbfounds me that we continue to kick the can down the road and have faith in a country, the US, that is reorientating and reprioritizing its own national interests, as it's entitled to do. But our countries, these kind of middle power liberal democracies, have this kind of learned inability to question the higher order of doing things. Like, throw it out the window. Let's find a smarter way to do this. And that brings me back to a point you made about the Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Was it CANZUK? How do you say it?
CANZUK.
CANZUK. This idea. CANZUK. Okay. I like it. But I feel like AUKUS, and this will be a point for historians to muse on in 3 decades' time, AUKUS has done a very awful thing for all sorts of defence acronyms, because it's really just solidified the fact that they are handshake photo ops and not much actually happens. There's no output, right? So I am increasingly, it's my next kind of project that I want to start working on, is making the Anglosphere great again, to steal from Trump. But the idea that we don't make it a network of former Commonwealth countries, or, I mean, first of all, Five Eyes should be put on war footing yesterday. Make that work. We don't need to reinvent the wheel with some of these international partnerships and groupings. But the Anglosphere, I think it needs to be returned to in many ways. I've been following what ASEAN's been able to do in the region of Southeast Asia. So there are absolute ways to unlock some kind of permeating commonalities between a number of Anglosphere countries. Obviously Commonwealths, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, South Africa throw in there, Ireland. There's plenty of ways that we can bring in like-minded, politically aligned countries who have enduring, no matter how far they go on the kind of liberal democracy scale, we have enduring interests in generally right about the same things. Why aren't we unlocking that? And I guess the one, I've been slowly having this conversation in some circles in Canberra, and I guess the factor that's thrown at me is, oh, well, Liz, it's, the 21st century. We can't be having Anglosphere discussions because it takes a racist. It absolutely takes a racist element, but it's not about that. It's about English speaking.
That's why we called it CANZUK. CANZUK was short form for Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK, and it was used sometimes in diplomatic circles because we all voted the same. We had the same values, the same interests, the same histories, the same traditions, and we're all pluralistic democracies. So we're not the old white Anglosphere of Churchill's time. we're modern countries, but with a shared commitment for values. And so we've talked about some of those values here today. I'm conscious of time, but this has been great. From handshakes to hocus pocus, our discussion of Australia, UK, US, AUKUS, discussion of MAGA, make the Anglosphere great again, or make smart thinking great again. All of these were incredible topics, and thank you very much for taking us through them, and a little summary of the Australian election and what we weren't hearing in our news story. So, Dr. Elizabeth Buchanan, thank you very much for blue skying all this with us today.
Thank you, Erin. And can I have one parting shot?
One parting shot.
Okay. The priority for Canada and Australia together would be to really put our stamp on the Pacific Theatre. So Canada is essentially the roof of the Pacific Theatre, and Australia is the floor. And if we think of globe, if you look at a globe and you think of this vast amount of ocean in which, China is rewriting the rules of resources in the seabed, of fisheries, is pushing out its island chain, basically to be tapping on San Francisco tomorrow. Canada and Australia have a geographical position that needs to be weaponized. And I think we've got plenty of work to do to show that we are innovative, we are passionate, and I fear that we've lost our way.
Very fair dinkum comment from our friend from Australia. We can own the Pacific together, the roof and the floor. I love that. This has been a really good discussion, Liz. Let's stay in touch, and let's keep people informed, because these hocus pocus discussions will keep going unless people really are demanding more. And that's the point of the podcast I still do after leaving politics, is to make sure we have more long form informed discussions about important topics. So thanks for blue skying polar issues with us today.
Thanks, Erin.